to today's episode. First of all, welcome new subscribers. I think there are like 20 of you this week. Thank you so much for subscribing. Thank you everybody who shared this channel. Thank you all subscribers who've been with me from the beginning of the journey. I appreciate all of you, and we continue hitting those milestones. I am promising you something big when we reach 1,000 subscribers. I know it looks like it will take a while, but I think if you all share, we will reach there faster. And I also know that there's a couple of you, I think 90% according to my YouTube stats, who watch and they have not subscribed. So I really appreciate it if you subscribe as well. I also just want to say thank you for I think my patterns video is one of the most popular ones because a lot of people have watched it, and I just want to say thank you for watching my content. And I will be doing another part of patterns much later, getting more deep into them, but I just thought that at least this week I will not do such a very serious video. It's going to be something more relatable to a lot of people who've always thought about sewing. So welcome, let's do this. So when I started in the fashion industry, basically like many years ago, there was a lot of pressure I put on myself to be a certain kind of designer, and I wanted to be popular, and I wanted to make clothes that people would like. I didn't really think about the practicality of the clothes so much. I just knew that whatever I put on paper, it had to happen. And of course the reality really checks in when you go to fashion school. But apart from that, there's so many other mistakes you make even out of school, and I really thought that it would be wise to cover some of the mistakes people make when they're beginners in sewing. Whether you're sewing as a hobby or sewing in your profession, it's important to know what these are. So of course some of them would be what you buy. I know, like, one of the biggest questions I get is how much someone should spend on equipment like sewing machines, and things like the tools you should buy, what you should have, what you don't have to have. There are so many, and I want to cover them. I'll probably cover them in slide form just so that it's easier to follow, and it also helps me not make the video so long. So welcome to today's episode, and let's begin.
Buying a sewing machine can be very, very complicated because you need to consider basically your budget, and if you even want to do this in the long term. So the first mistake I've seen a lot of people do is that they want to buy a fancy sewing machine that does so many things and has so many stitches. And the truth is, when you're starting out, you really don't need that kind of a machine. You need a machine that's practical enough to be able to do your projects with, and that if you decide that you do not want to continue with sewing, you can easily sell, or you can easily upgrade if you continue to sew, because generally, trust me, once you start loving to sew, you probably invest in machines. So just look at the tips here. The quality matters. You don't have to spend a lot of money on a sewing machine. Consider the maintenance, because you need to pay for maintenance every 3 months, and consider even the availability of spare parts. So do not just buy a fancy machine and that is computerized. And then first of all, those computerized machines, if the software is not working, you might not be able to use your machine. So I would advise you, if it's your first machine, do not buy a computerized one. So that's sewing machines. Second mistake, I can say I've been victim of this, is basically starting more than one project at a time. This is usually a huge mistake because you get very distracted. Fine, there is the excitement of you really want to do this thing, you really want to see how it's going to come up, but do not, especially when you're a beginner, do not start more than one project. Okay, this also goes to professionals. Don't start more than one project, just do one project at a time. And you will learn from your mistakes, because you will make mistakes when you're beginning, and then when you do your next project, you can continue and it will motivate you to do even more and more projects. So do not start more than one project. Stick to one, finish, do the next one. Using the wrong tools. I know this sounds like, how would you use the wrong tools? One of the major ones that you've probably heard people talk about, especially if you are around people who sew a lot, is using paper scissors and fabric scissors anyhow. You're not supposed to cut your fabric scissors with you're not supposed to use it to cut anything else, because if you use it especially on paper, they become blunt. I've also gone to a lot of sewing workshops, especially tailors, and they generally use the basic minimum, and sometimes they don't even have a seam ripper. So you'll find that they have to undo an outfit because maybe they sewed it badly and they start using scissors and it damages the fabric, and sometimes they don't have chalk and they use biro pens and it ruins your clothes, and there's just a lot I see. So try and just have the correct equipment for the task. It really goes a long way. It also helps you plan your tasks better. Then there is this taking measurements wrongly, basically taking them wrong, because maybe you're on your own and you don't have anyone to help you measure, or you are feeling some kind of way about your body, or you decide, I'm going to lose weight, I will make this waist a bit tighter. Yes, do not do that. Just take your measurements as they are and then learn from that. Because you're a beginner at this stage, make it with what you have. Learn how to sew, perfect your sewing skill, and then after that, once you feel like you're very good at sewing, then you can play around with measurements if you want to make it tighter, and all that. But just be very realistic when you're taking measurements, or have someone take measurements for you, because they will care more about being accurate. They will not be thinking so much about how uncomfortable you're feeling with how many inches you've added on your waist and all that. But there are some places generally you cannot reach when you're taking your measurements. So definitely have someone take those specific measurements. Just guide them. If you're not sure yourself, and maybe you're on your own and you're starting this thing, maybe by watching YouTube videos and all that, there are a lot of resources online on how to take measurements correctly. And try and stick to, if you're buying patterns or you're getting instructions from a certain website, it's better to use their method of taking measurements to do your projects, so that it's just in line with it. You continue to learn more the more you make projects and your clothes. So number 5 is buying sewing supplies before you sew your first project. Basically, this is that excitement of just buying things because they look pretty. And I know it's an addiction. I have bought fabrics before just because I like them, and then I come home with them and I have no idea what I'll do with it, because I wasn't thinking about it in a practical way. So for me, fabric is my temptation, but I know people who collect seam rippers, tape measures, the people who have pin cushions in all sorts of colors, the people who have pouches for everything. Like, just don't go spending money because those things look nice, or because the person selling told you, oh, you could also get this lace and this lace. And just trust me, every person who sews has a cluttered space. Arranging that cluttered space is usually a nightmare in itself, but you always have things that you've barely used or you've had them for years and you don't use. So try and just stick to buying things you need for the project you're working on at that time. It will really save you a lot of money. And especially if you're doing it as a hobby, just try and buy as per project. It will also help you finish your old projects faster before you move on to new projects. Considering that my last video was about patterns, so you know the importance of the instructions of patterns. So disregarding how patterns work would really mess you up as a beginner. So you have to understand patterns, know how they work, and don't assume the instructions that have been given are just pure suggestions. They're actually instructions because the person who created the pattern had specific projects in mind and specific materials in mind, and they knew what they were doing when they were creating those patterns, especially if you're buying the pattern or you're drafting from a book where you've been given instructions and you need to follow them. So do not disregard sewing instructions, pattern suggestions, the instructions for cutting, the instructions for drafting, or just pay attention to all patterns. And please do not buy a pattern that's so complicated and you're a beginner and you have to probably simplify this pattern, and maybe you don't even know how to do that before you can use it. And do not buy a pattern in your ready-to-wear size. As I've said it before, your size according to what you usually buy online, your online clothes, is not what will determine your body size or your body measure, because every designer does adjust those size according to their brand and their target market. So buy patterns according to your measurements, not your body size. So please take note, because all patterns usually have the measurements of at least your bust, waist, and hips. Know that, and then get patterns according to that. Some patterns are graded, so you will have to work. You can work within sizes, but if you're buying just one specific size, ensure that you know your measurements. This is something that I have noticed a lot of tailors ignoring, the grain line. When you have a fabric, there is this side of the fabric that doesn't fray off. That is usually called the grain line or the self edge. That is the self edge actually. So it doesn't fray off. That self edge usually guides you on how to cut your fabric. So if you want to cut in the direction of the self edge, then all your pieces have to line up like that. If you want to cut it the other way, all your pieces have to line up like that. The only one that has a bit of wiggle room is cutting it on the diagonal, which is the bias, but you have to be very advanced in your sewing and your cutting to understand about the bias line. But do not just cut haphazardly, and do not decide that, oh, this sleeve, it doesn't fit in this direction, so I will cut it in this direction. Just make sure you buy enough fabric for your project, cut it in the same direction, and sew it. This I'm telling you from experience, because when I was a student, I actually cut something on 2 different directions, and I saw what happens. It actually twists your outfit. It doesn't remain straight on your body. It kind of twists because the fabric is also trying to find its direction, so to speak. So please pay attention to grain lines. It's very, very important. Another thing is consider the fabric you're using. Do not skip fabric preparation, because there are fabrics that actually might need to be washed to be pre-shrunk. Do not just buy fabric without understanding how that fabric works. If you need to pre-shrink your fabric, make sure you do, because what happens is after the outfit is washed, it will shrink. And this has happened to me, so I know that these things happen. And also there are some fabrics that you might need to iron first to remove wrinkles before you cut, or maybe it just makes the outfit bigger. And some need to be dry cleaned before. So just pay attention to fabric instructions. Try and learn about the fabric you're going to use before you buy it. Most sellers should know about the fabric. In fact, another thing you need to check is if it removes color. That's usually another major thing. So just check all that before you decide on the fabric for your project. There are fabrics also that are generally very difficult to work with. Some of them are chiffon, because it's slippery, velvet, corduroy, because changing even the direction of the fabric changes how the whole outfit looks. Please understand, the fabric you should start with should always be just simple, nice, cotton, non-stretch fabric. Do not use stretch fabric as well. It needs a different kind of stitch to sew. Understand the fabric you're using, and understand that some have a different sewing technique from what a basic sewer or someone who's learning how to sew would know. So don't buy fabric that's hard to use just because it's pretty and because you've always wanted this velvet dress. Practice your sewing, understand your sewing. If you want to practice on a fabric you've never used before, buy a small piece, try a very small sample, just practice stitches on it and everything before you buy a large piece of fabric for your project. Just understand that fabrics, every different fabric is treated differently, and sometimes you'll find that there are some people who, because they use cotton, they always just stick to cotton because it's easier. And there are people who like chiffon and they'll always use chiffon like that. But cotton generally is the best fabric to start with because it's just easier to work with in terms of manipulating it and doing various projects with it. Also, if you know that you want to be in sewing in the long term, please learn the terminology used in sewing. It comes with time. You don't have to know everything at a go, but you need to understand the terms, because especially if you are going to work with projects maybe that you see online, You will realize that they use sewing terminology and you don't understand what they mean by some of these terms. You get lost. And also when you're buying things, generally we try to use the correct term, although the truth is, like here in Kenya, sometimes you just have to use the local term, the term that the people selling understand. But do use sewing terminology in your work. It will just make your life easier, especially if you want to be advanced. But you learn it in time, so don't stress about it, but do pay attention to them. Do not ignore the sewing rules. Some of the rules people like to ignore when they're sewing are not putting enough seam allowance, or, like seam allowance. Okay, there are some books that will tell you to do 1 centimeter. If you're a beginner, I'd advise you to at least do 1 inch or 2 centimeters. Do iron your seams as you go, as you're sewing. Press them open. Do not mark your fabrics with permanent things, and then use notches and pins when you're sewing to help you mark as you go on with your sewing project. Basically just to match up your patterns and just make sure it just helps you with less mistakes. Trust me. Actually, for beginners, I even advise you do tacks. If you don't know tacks are, they're like big running stitches. If you don't know what running stitches are, I don't know how to help you right now. But yes, do something to mark so that when you're sewing it's easier. Do not pull your fabric when you're sewing on the machine. I know it's very tempting because you feel like you really need to guide the machine, but there are these things called feed dogs, the zigzags that you see at the base of your machine when you're sewing under your presser foot. It naturally glides the machine, so you don't need to pull your machine. All you need to do is guide it so that it doesn't go off rail, but you don't pull. It can even break your needle. And then double check as you sew. Always just make sure you're sewing on a straight line, or you're sewing on the line that you intended to sew, and do not forget to backstitch, basically reinforcing the stitch so that it doesn't unravel after you have finished sewing, because that happens a lot, especially with beginners. You can easily forget. Another thing I would advise is do not sew for other people while you're still learning. I know it's very tempting and offer you money and people get excited and suddenly you have all these repair jobs. It can really discourage you if you end up not finishing the project on time and upset the person. You can underestimate the scope of the work. You can also underestimate how long it will take you to complete it. You can also underestimate the complexity of the work. And sometimes those clients might overestimate your skill. Just because you've just started learning how to use a machine doesn't mean that you're an expert. So please avoid it. Be very confident at your skill level and at your project. And even when you have sewn for a while, just stick to the things you really, really know how to do before you get that confidence of just sewing for everybody. It really does take time. I've made those mistakes. I've even lost clients because of it. So this is just my advice to you. Do not take shortcuts when you are sewing. I know it's tempting sometimes to take shortcuts so that you can finish a project faster, but sometimes those shortcuts you end up paying for it later and you end up undoing the whole project, and then you have to start all over again, which is very, very discouraging. So just do it the long way first. Learn how to do it the long way, and then later on you can do it the short way. There's actually a systematic way on how to put together an outfit, which I will share in a later video. And so just follow those rules, and then it will just be less stressful for you. Another thing, just learn to take a break from your project. If you feel like you've been taking so long, it's frustrating, you can't figure things out, things are not working, you just want to finish and it's not finishing, just take a break. And maybe sometimes I've taken a break from a project and I actually get a new idea on how to complete the project, because sometimes you're just tired and frustrated and you don't have the mental capacity to finish the project. So do learn to take a break when you need to. You don't have to force yourself to finish every single thing at that time. Even if you really wanted to just start another project, just take a break from this project. You can decide to start another project to get your mind off of this one, but taking a break is also important. And lastly, allow yourself to make mistakes and do not get discouraged by those mistakes. That is when you learn the most. Some of my designs have actually come off because of mistakes. So please do not let mistakes discourage you. It's very important that you just keep pursuing sewing and keep practicing and keep going at it. I've seen so many people giving up just because they're making mistakes, and mistakes is part of learning. So I would encourage you, just keep going. You never know how things will turn out, and you'll become a better sewist because of it. So I hope these have been helpful.
So this is the end of the video. I'm sure that list is a bit overwhelming, and I'm sure some of them maybe didn't look like they were mistakes at the beginning. Buying an expensive sewing machine is not always the ideal purchase when you're starting to sew. Also, don't go and buy like the cheapest machine, because I know there are all these funny hand sewing machines and all these other types of machines that people are selling out there. They're not always the best. You have to think about how long you want to be sewing, whether it's a hobby or whatever. Like, just invest in a good machine. Always invest in a good machine, but it doesn't have to be the most expensive machine. And understand things like computerized sewing machines can be a nightmare to work with. Also, you don't have to buy every single fabric you see. I will say that I have a habit of buying fabric. Of course, now I limited it, but I think at the beginning it was very, very bad. I think now my eyes are used to seeing a lot of print and color, and I can let go of a fabric. But there was a time I could not let a good fabric go. So you don't have to buy so much fabric when you're starting out. Even if you're starting out professionally, you have to be sure that the fabric will be used. And your taste in fabric is very different from your client's taste in fabric. So it takes a while to know what your clients like, and really you don't really need to buy a lot of fabric when you're starting out. Also, experimenting. I know it might not be on the list, but a lot of people who sew do not like to experiment. I don't know why, but it's how you come up with new things. I think the mistake here is not experimenting. Experimenting is very important. You need to know weights of fabric, you need to know how they work. If you look at a lot of my work, you'll realize I feature a lot in my social media platforms because I experiment a lot with myself. I will make something for myself most of the time, trying out new designs before I basically recommend them to my clients. So experiment as much as possible. It's very important, and you do not have to experiment with expensive fabric. You should experiment with the cheapest fabric you could get. And I'm sure the rest of the list was very helpful. Thank you for watching this video to the end. I appreciate all your support, and I guess I will see you next week. Bye.